you know, the drama of this is just incredible. It's just really incredible that at the same time you've got this very dramatic rescue of the British Army and bringing them from the continent across the Straits of Dover to Great Britain, a miraculous escape that allows the British Army to fight another day. On top of that, you've got this crisis among the war leaders in Great Britain about whether or not to stay in the war or to negotiate with Hitler. And in some respects, Halifax, who I talked about this on Thursday, he's one of the leading voices arguing that Great Britain should negotiate some kind of agreement with Hitler. Great Britain had some cards to play. They did have this huge empire. They had India. The other thing, the British could have retreated to Canada. Canada was still part of the Dominion. So Great Britain, in some respects, had some cards to play. In 1940, it's at the head of an empire, although it's an empire that's collapsing pretty quickly, would collapse after World War II. And so, yeah, just the draw. What's going to happen here? And Hitler, of course. And we talked about this last week. Hitler basically just thought, okay, the war's over. I've won. It's over except for the details. And again, Hitler doesn't consider the British racially inferior as he does the poor victims that he conquers in Eastern Europe. Certainly, he would have taken control of Great Britain, and he would have, Hitler was Hitler. He's a monster. But what he was promising that if Great Britain negotiated with Germany, it would be a soft peace. In other words, well, Churchill didn't believe this for a second, whereas Halifax was more persuaded. And I guess the other thing about Halifax is that he just thinks Great Britain's lost and might as well recognize reality. And he's not that horrified by Hitler. He opposes Hitler. He knows Hitler is bad, but he's not that horrified by him. Whereas Churchill is, for all his problems, Churchill recognizes that Hitler is one of history's great monsters. So on May 27th, you have a meeting of the War Cabinet. It's just the seven of the top leaders. And it comes down to Halifax versus Churchill. And when Halifax, he comes in, he says, look, I've talked to the Italian ambassador. And Italy now, we haven't talked about this in the course, but it's run by Mussolini. And Mussolini, of course, the Italian dictator, was an ally of Hitler. Halifax comes in and says, the Italians want to mediate. They want to mediate between Great Britain and Nazi Germany. They want to serve as mediators. They want to meet and they want to discuss some kind of negotiation, some kind of settlement. And Halifax is pushing Churchill really, really hard to meet with the Italian ambassador and to begin this process of negotiation through the Italians with the Germans. But Churchill just, it's something that he just does not want to do. And he kind of parries Halifax. He can't outright say no. He can't outright say to Halifax, "You're a coward. This is ridiculous." But he kind of parries. He kind of plays Halifax off. He kind of plays a little bit of a delay game. And ultimately, what he says later is that he believed that Britain going down fighting was much better than if Britain just surrendered without fighting. That at least by fighting, that it would help build morale. Maybe Great Britain would get, ultimately, if Great Britain lost, it would get a better peace treaty. But Churchill is just not ready, and he's not willing to begin a negotiation with Hitler. Now, Halifax at that point starts to play his trump card in this May 27th meeting. He is very frustrated with Churchill. He later writes in his diary, "It drives me to despair when Churchill works himself up into a passion of emotion when he ought to make his brain think and reason." So for Halifax, basically his thinking is we've lost. And Churchill is just being emotional. Churchill's being Churchill. And Churchill just can't see facts. And what Halifax says in the meeting is, look, if you don't negotiate with the Italians, if you continue this course of fighting the war and continue the war, I'm going to resign. And they took a walk together in the garden, and Halifax repeated this threat. And again, it seems odd to us, especially I think students in 2023. But if Halifax had resigned, and if he'd really gone after Churchill at this point, Churchill would have been forced out of power because Halifax still has a lot of authority in Great Britain. And the other thing to remember is these talks are all in secret. So you basically have like 7 people deciding the fate of England. So if Halifax had resigned, the British public wouldn't have known the larger, at this point anyway, wouldn't have known the larger context of the dispute between Halifax and Churchill. And a lot of people in Great Britain, including the king, still didn't trust Churchill. They thought he was a loose cannon. So what Churchill does, as I say, he tries to play off Halifax. He apologizes to Halifax. He says, "I'm sorry that you think I'm coming on too strong." He doesn't agree to meet with the Italians, but he tries to basically manipulate Halifax by saying, "Oh, I'm sorry. I admire you so much," and Halifax stopped short of resigning at that point. Okay, so they meet the next day on May 28th. And once again, Halifax wants to negotiate with the Germans via the Italians, and Churchill says no. He says that, look, if we negotiate with Hitler, we're not going to get a good deal. Hitler will not let us have autonomy. Churchill didn't even know that the Germans were planning to put the Duke of Windsor, Edward, who had resigned. The Germans were planning on putting him as King of England, but this had already been discussed, and King Edward, or Edward's wife, he was the king at this point, she was all for this, that her husband would be reinstated on the throne of England. And Churchill repeats his argument: look, nations that go down fighting will rise again. Those that surrender tamely were finished. Now, on May 28th, you have another key moment. Churchill goes, and the meetings so far had been with the 7 top members of the war cabinet. Churchill expands the circle, and he goes to Parliament, and he talks to about 25 members of the British Parliament, influential members of the British Parliament beyond the war cabinet. And he walks over there, and he kind of thinks about what he's going to say, and he makes this very powerful, very nationalistic argument that if we make peace now, we will not get good terms from the Germans. It's much better to fight it out than to make peace now. The Germans will demand our navy. They'll want to capture our navy. They'll want our naval bases. And then he says very powerfully, Great Britain will become a slave state. Great Britain will become a slave state of the Nazis. So Hitler expands the circle. He talks to folks. He goes to Parliament. He talks to about 25 leading members of Parliament from various different parties in Parliament, different factions in Parliament. Makes this very, very powerful speech. And the 25 politicians, who are quite powerful in their own right, they just go nuts when Churchill makes this speech saying, look, it's better to fight it out than surrender. They start shouting, they jump on a table, they pat him on the back. And they just showed tremendous support for Churchill's position. In fact, so much support that Churchill himself was surprised. So basically, after this meeting of the 25, the larger members of Parliament, the larger group of Parliament, Churchill has outmaneuvered Halifax. Even if Halifax had resigned at this time because Churchill refused to negotiate with the Italians, there were enough members of Parliament who were definitely behind Churchill that Halifax's resignation wouldn't have defeated Churchill, wouldn't have forced Churchill to resign. So, very, very interesting moment. You see the personalities at play here. Halifax, without a doubt, would have negotiated with Hitler, would have negotiated some kind of peace agreement. And my God, can you imagine what would have happened if Britain had surrendered in May of 1940? Don't take it for granted that Great Britain's going to stay in the fight. And this certainly is Churchill's finest hour. Um, you could argue he saved the West. Yeah, pretty amazing moment. And kudos to Churchill. Kudos to Winston Churchill. One last thing I'll say, though, it's kind of interesting. In his memoirs that he wrote after World War II, Churchill protects Halifax. In his memoirs, he doesn't really talk about how Halifax was trying to force him to negotiate with Hitler through the Italians. He kind of suppresses the story. And I don't know why. No one really knows why. Maybe. By the way, he gets Halifax out of England, though. He sends him to Washington to be the ambassador to Roosevelt. So he gets Halifax out of England. He wants him out of the country. But after the war, he protects him. Very, very, very complicated guy. But upshot, Great Britain stays in the war largely because of the actions of Winston Churchill.